When people talk about the countries of the Eastern Bloc, the story usually starts the same way, as if they were always catching up to the West. Cars, fashion, household technology. In almost every field, the socialist world seemed to be one step behind. Almost. There was one area where the East actually outperformed the so-called free world: public transportation. And its most recognizable symbol was the Hungarian Ikarus 200 series, one of the most produced buses in the world. Today, you'll find out how this socialist bus ended up in the United States, what the McDonnell Douglas aircraft company had to do with it, and how that story finally played out. If you compare public transportation in the Eastern Bloc and in the West, you'll see two completely different worlds. The key difference was that in socialist countries, public transport wasn't a commercial enterprise. It was funded by the state and treated as part of public infrastructure, not as a business. Routes were designed around accessibility rather than profit. Trams and trolleybuses operated in almost every major city, and sometimes even in small towns. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was widespread, stable, and affordable. In the United States, things developed very differently. Even before the war, the country had chosen the personal car, and by the 1950s, with the rapid expansion of highways, the automobile had become a symbol of the American way of life. Streetcars disappeared, bus networks shrank, and without government subsidies, public transportation slowly declined. In America, taking the bus was seen as a choice for those who couldn't afford a private car, while in socialist countries, it remained the primary way to get around. Two worlds, two philosophies. So what had to happen for them to cross, and for Hungarian Ikarus buses to make their way to America? And the thing is, the American government was aware of the public transportation problem, and it wouldn't be fair to say that nothing was being done. In the 1960s, officials began trying to bring order to the passenger transportation system. During that period, the main and most influential bus manufacturer in the American market was GM, which, in the late 1950s, had started producing the New Look series, the backbone of the country's passenger transport system. These buses couldn't be called bad, but the government decided to launch two new programs to develop more modern and comfortable models. The first program was called Transbus, which eventually led to the introduction of the GM CRT S-Bus. The second, Superbus, focused on creating an articulated bus capable of carrying more passengers while reducing operating costs. Only European manufacturers took part in the Superbus program, and the winner was the German company MAN, which in 1976, together with the American AM General, began supplying MAN AMG SG220 buses to the U.S. market. Both passengers and transport operators were satisfied with the bus, and at the time, many believed that articulated buses represented the future of American public transportation. Then came the fuel crisis, which forced many Americans to give up their personal cars and switch to public transport, further strengthening that belief. And now it's time to talk about airplanes, or more precisely, about the company McDonnell Douglas, which in the 1970s was doing quite well and at some point decided to expand its market by turning its attention to the countries of the Eastern Bloc. By that time, relations between the United States and the socialist world were no longer as tense, and there was even talk of a certain thaw. The first country McDonnell Douglas established cooperation with was Yugoslavia, which received a batch of the latest wide-body DC-10 airliners. The deal was a success, and soon afterward, the Americans approached the government of the Hungarian People's Republic with the same offer: to supply DC-10s for the national airline Malev. The Hungarians responded positively. These aircraft were expected to help Malev become the leading carrier in Eastern Europe and strengthen its position on the Western European market. But there was one major problem. American planes had to be purchased in US dollars, and poor Hungary simply didn't have that kind of money. There was only one way to obtain such a large sum: by selling something that the Americans themselves needed, and in significant quantities. And as you might have already guessed, the Hungarian government quickly realized that this something could very well be the Ikarus. Ikarus, by the mid-1970s, was the largest bus manufacturer not only in Europe, but in the world. The 200 series model held first place in total production volume, and only later gave up the lead to the Lviv bus. Ikarus buses were exported to more than 60 countries, and annual output reached around 10,000 units. When the Hungarian factory was instructed to prepare buses for the US market, the news was met without much enthusiasm. The plant was already loaded with orders for years ahead. But Ikarus was a state-owned company, and if the government decided it needed to enter the American market, there was nothing left to do but follow the directive. As the United States favored articulated buses, Ikarus models destined for the US market were planned specifically in this configuration. Even though the Hungarians already had suitable models, they could not simply ship them to the United States and sell them as is. There were several reasons for that. Under the same Superbus program in which Ikarus was now participating, strict requirements were set for the buses. These included precise specifications for length, height, and width. No more, no less. But the most important requirement was at least 50% localization, not only in components, but also in assembly. In other words, fully finished buses could not just be shipped from Europe by sea. Final assembly had to take place in the United States and account for at least half of the production process. The first major issue encountered during adaptation to American requirements was width. The width of the 280 model, chosen as the basis for modernization, was 250 centimeters, while regulations required 259 centimeters. Naturally, it was not possible to simply cut the bus lengthwise and weld in a 9-centimeter insert. Things were more complicated. However, the Hungarians found a solution. The front and rear sections remained the standard size, and only the middle section was widened. This allowed them to meet the requirements, while avoiding costly new body stamp dies, glass molds, and other complicated redesign work. McDonnell Douglas, as an interested party, did not stay on the sidelines and took on the search for an American contractor who could organize the final assembly of the Ikarus buses in the USA. Such a partner became the Los Angeles-based company Crown Coach Corp., which was engaged in the production of school buses and fire trucks. And participation in this project was perceived by American standards, small company, as a new stage of development and an opportunity to take a more significant position in the U.S. bus market. Crown Coach rather energetically joined the process, expanded its staff, and took the most active part in organizing the assembly of the Ikarus buses. In 1976, the first prototype of the Ikarus, fully meeting American requirements, was built. In addition to the already mentioned body width, for export to the USA, the bus, designated Crown Ikarus 286, received American Cummins engines, automatic transmissions, and a chassis of local production, as well as reinforced bumpers. Inside, 2 independent air conditioners were installed, wheelchair lifts, and seats that met federal safety requirements. It was manufactured in Hungary and, in finished form, shipped by sea to the USA, where it arrived in December of the same year. The price of the prototype turned out to be very high, about $175,000, while a similar American bus, even though it was not articulated, cost around $90,000. However, this was only a demonstration unit, and further localization of production was expected to significantly reduce the cost of serial buses. Testing of the Ikarus on American roads began. The bus was taken from state to state, from city to city, and shown to local transit operators. Moreover, the driving between cities and participation in local demonstrations was personally handled by the chief designer, Anna Lasso, consistently causing genuine reactions among Americans who saw a fragile girl behind the wheel of a huge articulated bus. Whether it was her charm that played a role, or perhaps the Ikarus itself turned out to be successful, or maybe both. But the reviews of everyone who interacted with the new bus were positive. They noted its pleasant design and good operating characteristics. The tests were completed by the fall of 1979, and they did not go to waste. The first contract was signed for the delivery of 102 articulated buses to one of the American carriers. It was a good start. Everything was prepared, and all that remained was to launch the process, build the buses, and deliver them to the customer. However, Crown Coach turned out not to be ready to begin production, and the first 15 buses were built entirely in Hungary, after which they were shipped to the United States. After that, Crown Coach joined the process, and the next batch was assembled according to a pre-approved plan. The process worked as follows. From the United States, axles, the engine, and the transmission were sent to Hungary. The Hungarians installed all of this onto painted bodies, added windows, headlights, and part of the electrical equipment. After that, the bus kits were shipped back to the United States, where final assembly took place at Crown Coach facilities. The required livery was applied, the interior was installed, and other components were added. With such logistics, there was no way the serial buses could have an acceptable price. The price of Ikarus buses remained above average compared to competitors. Nevertheless, new customers continued to appear. There was no explosive demand because of the price, but the orders still came in. The first years of operation went relatively smoothly. The Ikaruses proved themselves to be sturdy and generally reliable buses. And even though there weren't many orders yet, all parties had already begun receiving profit. The revenue distribution was interesting. 50% went to Ikarus, 25% to Crown Coach, and the remaining 25% was taken by McDonnell Douglas as the initiator of the project. The first serious problems appeared in 1985, when Portland-based operator TriMet filed a lawsuit against Crown Coach. A few years earlier, the company had purchased 87 Ikaruses, but claimed that they constantly broke down, making it nearly impossible to operate them, let alone earn money. According to the operator, at least a quarter of the buses were constantly under repair and never went out on the route. The case never reached court. The parties settled out of court. However, the media reaction was significant, and Ikarus's reputation was essentially destroyed. After that, no new orders were placed, and in 1986, Crown Coach completely stopped offering the buses to customers. In total, 246 Ikaruses were produced for the U.S. market. But the North American story of the Hungarians did not end there. In the same year, 1985, McDonnell Douglas and Ikarus, together with the Canadian company Orion Bus Industries, agreed to produce buses in Canada. These vehicles received the name Orion Ikarus 286, operated in Ottawa and Toronto, and production continued until 1989. However, the number built was again small, only 275 units. At first glance, by the standards of Ikarus, which was actively strengthening its position in the European market, and, in peak years, was producing up to 13,000 buses annually. Total deliveries to North America, just over 500 units, seem almost insignificant. But the Ikarus management still recalls and emphasizes this experience. As they note, although the volume of deliveries was modest, it was this that allowed the company to become the largest supplier of imported articulated buses in North America. For comparison, the previously mentioned MAN supplied 399 buses to the United States, while Ikarus delivered 521. And what about McDonnell Douglas, which, in fact, started this whole story? In 1979, the USSR sent troops into Afghanistan, and relations with Western countries deteriorated sharply. The Soviet leadership pressured Hungary to abandon the purchase of enemy equipment. In turn, McDonnell Douglas also faced pressure in the United States, with hints that selling aircraft, which, among other things, are a source of technology, to the allies of the enemy would be highly undesirable. As a result, not a single DC-10 was sold to Hungary. That's the kind of complicated, but I hope interesting, story we ended up with. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, and see you in the next interesting stories.